get started, so thank you all for being here for our first candidate forum about searching for a new director of the Lake Erie Center. We do have we'd like your feedback, obviously, so over here are some paper forms of a survey as well as Paris's CV. This is mainly for those who watch things online so that they can fill out the survey online when they're done. So get that off the screen into more important things. And so I'd like to thank Paris Collingsworth for making it out here today. He flew in from Chicago last night. He's been in Chicago for about 6 years, working for the Illinois Indiana Sea Grant as their Great Lakes ecosystem specialist. He's also a assistant research professor at University of Purdue. He's spent a lot of time in the Great Lakes region, both at Ohio State for his PhD. Prior to that, he was farther south in Southern Illinois for his master's degree, and we had an interesting conversation where he grew up in Ohio but decided to go somewhere completely different and went down to Birmingham, Alabama for his bachelor's degree. So he left Ohio and then has slowly been moving north. And now we'll see thinking about coming back south here a little bit. His research has been on the Great Lakes, some of the stuff he's published on his own, or as lead author, dealing with climate change as a stressor on the fisheries, or comparing population dynamics of alewife and bloaters in Lake Michigan. So a number of publications. He's been involved with a lot of collaborative projects from a lot of different people within the Great Lakes region, grants from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the Great Lakes Fisheries Trust, Ohio Division of Wildlife, and numerous others. So with that, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I want to hear from what Paris has to say and talking about a potential direction for the Lake Erie Center. Thank you, Paris.
Thanks for that introduction, John. And as you can probably tell from the title, I'm a bit of an incrementalist and not really prone to big dramatic statements. But I do want to talk about, what I see as a particular opportunity and a potential direction for the Lake Erie Center. And I want to also talk a little bit about how, my experience would help us to get there. But I do want to start off, John did provide a bit of my background, but I guess I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the strategy for getting there. So as John mentioned, I did do a PhD at Ohio State. I worked right here in Lake Erie, essentially looking at spatial variation and reproductive condition of yellow perch, a really popular sport fish in Lake Erie, looking in the western and the central basin. And several different papers came from that, doing a lot of different field surveys and some laboratory studies as well. But then for my postdoc, what I wanted to do is look a little bit more broadly. So one thing I noticed during my time at Ohio State, focusing very specifically on a specific part, a specific shoreline of the lake. I wanted to think more about, I wasn't seeing a lot of sort of cross-lake comparative work being done. And what I quickly learned is the way to do that is, the fastest way to do that is to go sort of a federal route. And so I did a postdoc in Ann Arbor with the USGS Great Lakes Science Center. The Great Lakes Science Center is responsible essentially for prey fish surveys across all of the Great Lakes. So for my postdoc, I was working with a really nice data set for prey fish in Lake Huron and Michigan. And so we did some comparative recruitment dynamics of bloater and alewife in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and did a little bit more population dynamic modeling, looking at rainbow smelts in Lake Michigan as well. So in general, the interest was to sort of start from a really specific location and get broader, and was actually able to continue along this trajectory with my current position. So again, working with Purdue University, Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, and again, a really sort of key federal interaction here was working with the EPA's Great Lakes National Program Office. And what they needed was someone to come in and basically promote and provide outreach for their monitoring and their science programs. So the sort of initial charge was to improve access to the EPA limbo monitoring data, which means, essentially making the data available for scientists, the monitoring data, the time series, but also making people, letting people understand the resources that are available aboard the Lake Guardian. So if you guys were at IAGLR and got to see the Lake Guardian, it's a tremendous resource. It's a ship of opportunity, though, and a lot of people don't understand that. So anybody can request time on the Guardian. They're probably not going to make a specific cruise just for you, but if you have a need and it meets with their current cruise schedule, you can go out there. You can use really cool instrumentation, like this is the Tri-Axis. This is basically like a vehicle that's just packed with instrumentation. It feeds real-time data through a fiber optic cable here that's connected to the ship, so we get information about nutrients, chlorophyll. There's a laser optical particle counter, so you get zooplankton density and abundance. So just really cool stuff that a lot of people don't know that they actually have access to. So through that, I also started working in a program called CSMI. And if you ever work with the government, they love acronyms. CSMI is the Cooperative Science and Monitoring Initiative. It's a binational program with EPA and Environment Climate Change Canada, where they're essentially putting extra resources into one lake each year for sort of for extra monitoring activity and also applied research activities. And so one of the first major years I worked with CSMI was on Lake Ontario. And so to sort of show how all this stuff works together, one of the questions that they wanted to know about in Lake Ontario were how are organisms utilizing the deep chlorophyll layer out in the middle of the lake. And so these red lines were where we did Tri-Axis tows. So towing this instrument throughout the water column, sort of out in the middle of the lake, during the nighttime and during the day. And then this is the type of data that you can generate from that. So this is the LEC plots. Here we're looking at temperature. So this is basically, temperature profile of the water column. And then the dots represent zooplankton densities. And so the reds and the warmer colors represent higher densities. The greens and the blues, the cooler colors represent lower densities. So using this sampling design, we're actually able to document the diel vertical migration of zooplankton. So during the day, they're sort of hanging out here down at the thermocline, and then we go back and sample the same stations at night, and they're sort of moving up the water column. So this is sort of how I've been able to maintain an applied research program throughout this position. And it's also been a really nice opportunity to, again, stay with that sort of broad spatial scale. So I just throw this up there. It's basically to show I've been doing research in at this point, all 5 of the Great Lakes. So it's been a really nice opportunity. But what you realize really quickly when you work at this broad level, what you can do is basically identify and characterize problems. You're not really working on providing solutions to those problems when you work at this big a scale. It's sort of intractable. So hence, sort of looking elsewhere. Now I'm wanting to sort of rein it back in and try to think about how to provide solutions to these problems. So for this presentation, we'll talk a little bit of introduction about some of the challenges that are facing Lake Erie. Talk about opportunities for the center to engage with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement process. So again, we're going to be dealing with acronyms, too much to spell out. So Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. What I would see is a potential specific role for the LEC in this process. And then sort of finish up with some examples of the type of engagement I've done that addresses these processes in my previous work. So to begin, I'm going to throw this up here again. I like this slide because it's really obvious, even from space, that Lake Erie is sort of a different system than the other Great Lakes. In the upper Great Lakes, we're dealing with issues of not enough nutrients. Here in Lake Erie, that certainly isn't the case, specifically or particularly in the Western Basin. In the Western Basin and across Lake Erie, what we're dealing with is sort of a re-eutrophication of Lake Erie, and the symptoms look different depending on where you are. I don't think I need to say too much in this room, but as we know, Western Basin dealing with potential for harmful algal blooms during the summer. In the Central Basin, hypoxia in the bottom waters of the Central Basin, which is a regular occurring phenomenon during the summer. And then in the Eastern Basin, particularly along the northern shoreline, the re-eutrophication is sort of showing up as increases in the benthic algae Cladophora. And then these Cladophora mats sort of get swept up into the shoreline and can cause problems there. The reason why I don't feel like I need to talk too much about this re-eutrophication here is because, Toledo is essentially, it's been ground zero. It's the largest city that's on the Western Basin where you guys can see the issues out in the lake, essentially from these windows. And some of the research that's been done at the Lake Erie Center is helped document this process. I mean, I remember the papers about, hexagenias back. And, we were talking about the Stu Lutzon's paper Back from the Dead, but it seemed like the eutrophication of the 70s and 80s was sort of past us. We know that that's not the case. We know now that, through the monitoring programs, there's been this re-eutrophication occurring. But now it seems like we're at a point now where at least, the federal governments are willing to address this problem. And so with the signing of the water quality agreement in 2012, there's been some nutrient abatement goals that have actually been developed for Lake Erie, specific goals that have been made for Lake Erie. One is to reduce cyanobacterial levels below certain ecosystem and public health thresholds in the Western Basin. So a specific sort of ecosystem-based goal for the Western Basin. In the Central Basin, to minimize the spatial extent of hypoxic zones that are associated with excess phosphorus. So the issue, is phosphorus. And so the specific goals of the water quality agreement is an overall 40% reduction in spring phosphorus loading from the Maumee River. So this is essentially representing sort of a natural experiment. We're going to really try to reduce phosphorus coming into the system. And I don't think, we have some models to sort of talk about what would happen, but I don't think we're really that aware of what's going to happen within this sort of natural experiment. So both of the countries, the US and Canada, have sort of settled on this idea of adaptive management as the approach that is going to be taken to address these water quality goals. So in the adaptive management process, you begin by sort of assessing what the problem is. So here, re-eutrophication. And then you design and implement a program to address those goals. So here we are at the sort of phosphorus reduction strategy. Where we're moving into is this, we're moving into the implementation, but then it's important that you monitor, how your sort of manipulation, your implementation changes the system, evaluate the process, and then adjust your implementation and to sort of reassess the problem. And then these Lake Erie phosphorus reduction, this is sort of the first stab at this adaptive management process for the Great Lakes. According to the water quality agreement. So I see this as sort of a unique opportunity for the Lake Erie Center. So the phosphorus reduction targets have been set. The ecosystem sort of responses that are expected due to this phosphorus reduction program align right with the sort of the expertise that's at the center and in this room. There's the limnology side, there's the fishery side, there's the beach health side. There's all of these things that sort of fall within the expertise of the LEC. And again, there's this sort of idea of location is sort of everything. And if you look at the, these are the priority tributaries that are going to be the focus of the phosphorus reductions. You know, obviously the Maumee sort of stands out, but the Lake Erie Center has sort of been a prime area to take advantage of this opportunity. So how I would see this engagement with this adaptive management program, if we sort of follow through the cycle, the specific activities that I can see happening within the LEC, when we're sort of assessing this problem, this is when we need to be sort of conducting outreach with the general public and is sort of gauging how they see the system and the sort of changes that they would like to see. And also local management agencies, things like, you know, watershed management districts, fisheries management agencies, and so on. And the design and the implementation of the adaptive management, that's a time for sort of model development and optimization of the design, the protocols that would go into this program. Monitoring and evaluation would be a time to sort of build collaborative research projects together. So going out and actually measuring the ecosystem responses. And then finally, the adjusting and reassessing would be, again, a time to sort of provide outreach to the local, to the public and local management groups, but also developing, hopefully you're learning a lesson, so you can develop education based on this process from there. So then getting into some of the more specifics, and this is sort of going back to like what are the sort of goals of the LEC. So first of all, from a research perspective, I think this provides a pretty tremendous opportunity for collaborative research. There are a lot of people who are doing similar sort of work in the Great Lakes region. It'd be nice to sort of use the LEC as a hub for collaborative research in this adaptive management process. And then hopefully what you're doing is you're identifying mechanistic relationships between, in this example, nutrient reduction, but then the responses in the ecosystem. In terms of education, I mean, there's obvious opportunities for training graduate students. I don't want to minimize that, you know, that's obviously important, but something that I've been involved with in the past has been, you know, curriculum development based on the data that's collected during monitoring programs and trying to sort of build lessons about, you know, how the science process works and how these mechanistic relationships between, you know, things like nutrient reduction and ecosystem responses, how those work as well. In terms of outreach, I think this is really an important thing, and one of the real benefits of, you know, having this sort of local footprint is just being able to communicate the goals and the results of the research with the local community. I think that's something that's really important, and it's a major gap in what the federal government is doing within these programs. So we wanted to provide outreach for the general public, but then also for a host of different sort of managers as well. Okay, so that's sort of the opportunity that I see, and now I just want to sort of wrap up with a few different examples of how I've kind of done some of these things in different situations. So for example, for each one I'm going to talk about like what was the problem identified, what was the response, and then sort of how we went forward. So, for example, in the sort of design and implementation of an adaptive management program, just this last year, Illinois Indiana Sea Grant was approached by the city of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they were trying to develop a sort of watershed modeling or a watershed management watershed management program for the Upper Maumee River. And the specific problem that they came to us with is they had some money set aside for green infrastructure. And what they wanted to know is how should we optimally place green infrastructure in an urban watershed. And so for our response, we worked with, and again, I don't want to act like this is all my doing. This is all very collaborative work. So I worked with Bernie Engel, who's the head of the agricultural engineering department at Purdue University. And essentially, he has a model that can look at nutrient reduction based on land use category, slope, all sorts of the different GIS characteristics. But what we're essentially doing is identifying critical areas in the watershed that would respond to specific, nutrient management goals. So for runoff, for total phosphorus, total nitrogen, and total suspended solids. For 2011, but also how those different land use categories are projected into the future. And so what we're essentially trying to do is design a nutrient reduction strategy based on identifying these critical areas. And then we optimize the implementation of green infrastructure placement based on the predicted nutrient reduction, but also more importantly, or equally important, the cost. And so this is an example of sort of using modeling to help design a nutrient reduction strategy. So for another example, something that I've been working on for a long time, for monitoring and assessment, and not thinking more about the research, but thinking more about making the data from monitoring programs available. So for this project, I've lost the picture somewhere. Anyway, so we developed a web page, and it's live. You can go look at it, greatlakesmonitoring.org. That essentially was designed to display EPA monitoring data and make it available to the public. But I was working with a group, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois, and they were a bit more ambitious. So what we essentially ended up doing was we designed a web page that could go out and retrieve data from any sort of web page that has, any sort of interface for accessing your data. So we can access online databases like the USGS stream gauges, STORET, the water quality portal, and actually put it and sort of geospatially reference it and put it on display, put data from multiple organizations on display in one place. I think that would be an excellent thing to do with the data that's collected here as well. And essentially what we're doing is making data available from multiple sources, making it all available in one location. And then finally, when you're thinking about sort of the reassessment and outreach, so the outreach is really good. That's what Sea Grant does really well. So this is just one example of the outreach program that we've developed from CSMI, and one very specific example. So we were at, one of the questions at CSMI was, what is the status of prey fish in Lake Ontario? The actual research that was done to assess the abundance of target species, in this case gobies and alewife, that was done during the CSMI process. And then I went out and got a grant, and essentially now Sea Grant is working as the outreach arm for CSMI. So Sea Grant develops outreach materials for CSMI directed at specific audiences. So in this case, we're talking to fisheries managers about what our results from CSMI say about the status of prey fish in Lake Ontario. This is a program that I really wish that the Ohio results were ready, but they should be coming out in 1 month. So the 2014 was the field year in Lake Erie for CSMI, and all of the outreach products have been now developed and sort of finalized by Ohio Sea Grant, and they should be available in June. So this is an outreach program that was sort of developed for CSMI. And so just to sort of wrap up, I do see the current Great Lakes Water Quality Agreements as a unique opportunity and a timely opportunity for the LEC. The work of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement Program can benefit from the LEC, particularly by providing local engagement and building collaborative research. Leadership for this is going to require some experience, someone with the relevant established federal connections, and so that's sort of I guess a plug for myself. And I just wanted to conclude and say thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for all the time that everyone's taken to meet with me over the last day, and welcome any questions.
Paris, with your outreach products, how do you know if they're having any effect, if anybody's using them or if they're changing any behaviors at all? Do you have any measure of that?
Well, in terms of how they're using them, that's a much easier answer. Because one thing we are going to do is we're going to develop sort of a central CSMI webpage that then each lake will have their own sort of like section. So we'll be able to track, views and all that. And I know, that's relatively, that's less important than is if behaviors are actually changing in response to that. And I think that's like sort of one of the central questions of doing this outreach is how much of an effect you're having. I guess my response would be to just make sure that this is out there, that this is getting into the right hands. I think that one of the most important steps, though, is to sort of engage in the outreach before and to try to ask, like, what are the specific questions that you guys feel you need answered? And I think CSMI does a pretty good job of that with regards to the management communities. So fisheries managers are asked about, what sort of information do you need in terms of like, lower trophic level dynamics. But the general public, I don't think really is I don't think they have much of a say in that so far. And that's something I'd like to see change. But in terms of actual behavior changing, I mean, unless someone's like changing fish regulations based on the output of your research, it's kind of hard to say. That's something the Sea Grant deals with a lot. It's kind of hard to document.
We find that there's so much information out there. There's so many websites and things that even by putting information out there, people don't necessarily go to it. You have to go to them and send them an email or something and say, look at this right now.
Yeah.
So there's
so,
so much out there.
Yeah, and that's true. One of the things that we are working on too is, and so Sea Grant does this really well, I think, is actually going out to the community. So like finding a time when there's like some sort of meeting that's going on. Again, I keep going back to fisheries groups because I know that pretty well. But when angler groups are having meetings, now what we're doing is we're developing sort of canned presentations, and then we're asking for permission to go speak at your walleye meeting, and then we're going to talk about the specific results that CSMI generated. So it's a more effective way of getting to the general public, which is sometimes a pretty hard one to break into.
So is that the sort of activity you think might be possible here, where you yourself or someone else from the LEC is going to these meetings?
Yeah, I think that would be important. Yeah, you can talk in generalities, about like engaging local groups. That's exactly what I'm referring to.
You mentioned using the LEC as a hub for collaborative research. Who do you envision these collaborators to be?
Well, so there's a lot of, there are a lot of local universities here. There's some representatives from Bowling Green here. I think that's an obvious one. I have some experience working with the USGS group out of Sandusky. USGS has an ecosystems group that works out of Ann Arbor that is pretty active in the Western Basin. I think I'd be open to pretty much anybody that would be interested. It's a super convenient, location. The facilities are nice. I would be open to any level of collaboration, I think.
There's always been a struggle here between University of Toledo and universities in this area and Ohio Sea Grant. And while they get along and there's a lot of collaboration, there's always some tugging. How do you see yourself in the role with Ohio Sea Grant?
Okay, well, I can't speak specifically to the past, but I feel like I have a pretty good relationship with Chris Winslow, who's the current director. We've been working on the CSMI process since the beginning. I also sit on the sort of committee that that works on the Lake Erie Millennium Network meetings as well, and I've had really good interactions with Chris in the past, and I would anticipate that carrying on into the future, unless there's some sort of political backstory that I don't know about in there.
Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, you want to be the hub, but they are the hub in many ways.
Mhm.
It's a bit strange.
Okay.
I was wondering if you would speak a little bit more to your vision for the Lake Erie Center within the University of Toledo, like what its role is within the university.
Okay, so I've been getting a lot of sort of signals throughout the day is that, you know, since the 2014 sort of water crisis, there's been a sort of a drumming up of support for water research within the University of Toledo, the university. And I would see this as sort of being like the flagship. We should be leading the charge with that.
So Paris, could you comment a bit more in a little more detail about some examples of leadership that you've had within some of these groups and within some of your administrative activities?
Okay, so so the leadership, so the best example would be then the CSMI, and I think I've told so many stories now that I can't remember if it was you directly, but I've talked about multiple times that it was essentially like just seeing a back, and seeing that something needed to be, some sort of leadership needed to be provided, and I've talked a little bit about like how my sort of leadership strategy is very sort of facilitative. That's kind of what I look for, is opportunities to sort of fill in the gaps and sort of lift everybody up through that. And so in CSMI, it's been a really mixed bag because I've worked on all of the lakes, and each lake has their own communities, research communities, and they have different, you know, personalities essentially. So, you know, in Lake Erie, there's a really well-established network of researchers that work together. And so for that, it's just basically like seeing what needs to be done. And so it might be something as simple as, okay, someone needs to step in and make sure that all the different ship schedules are lined up so all the cruises are going off as planned. It could be just something that simple. Whereas in Lake Huron, you know, there isn't very much of a research community there, and I'm basically been operating the entire like Lake Guardians like cruise schedule. I've been planning all the cruises, planning all of the research activities, staffing the cruises, developing the SOPs for the actual like data collection and processing. So that's sort of the way that I've seen my role, is just to sort of step in and fill in any gaps and sort of help the community that exists to achieve their goals.
For our CSMI project, you stepped in and helped coordinate what we were doing with the Buffalo group and trying to get it combined, because we were unaware of what they were doing.
Right.
And so you have sort of a combined idea of how we could present a combined product for Lake Erie. So I think that was a good example.
Thank you.
So what was the situation there? What happened?
So when Lake Erie was a bit of a unique experience, because that was the only lake where there was an RFP that was actually planned, or that was pulled off. They've tried to do RFPs in the past, but for whatever reason they got caught up in the bureaucracy. In Lake Erie, the project that Tom worked on and ended up pretty much serving as the role of PI by the end. They had identified like that sort of the issue of internal phosphorus dynamics was important enough that we're going to put this forward. And this is going to be something that we're actually going to do an RFP. Tom was part of a larger group that won that award, and they were doing it. There's another side of the CSMI, which is the federal groups who are all sort of working together, that don't necessarily, that were sort of separate from what Tom was doing. And but they're sort of going through the motions of the work that they agreed to do. And then what I saw was that there was essentially no communication going on, you know, and there are ways that the data that's being collected by Tom's group or the data that's being collected by Buffalo State could sort of work together. And so just trying to make sure that there was communication between the group and the possibilities for working together.
So, and I mean, you know this, at a university, all our funding is external.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have to get funds for everything we do.
Mm-hmm.
There's no base budget, you know, there's not
Right.
a base budget for my research or for John's research or anything. So, I mean, collaboration is great, but it doesn't necessarily, you can't collaborate without external funds to do the work. So, I mean, given the prognosis for environmental funding in the next couple of years,
Yeah.
you know, what are, you know, things that you might think of to work with individual researchers or education programs to, you know, to get funds to be able to continue this work?
Okay. So one thing is I don't think that we're going to be looking at zeros, you know, but your point is taken. It's going to be a strange funding environment over the next several years. One thing that I think but I'm still not, entirely pessimistic about getting federal funds for one of the specific reasons, and again, this is sort of shaded by my experience with CSMI, and you have direct experience with this, I know. The federal groups are really good. They have the infrastructure. They're really good at going out and they can collect the data. They can provide, the platforms to collect the data. What they really lack is any sort of the sort of personnel power to do the analysis and to do the interpretation side of it. And so there's been success in the past. You were one of the groups that gets, a postdoc or grad student funding to essentially go and do the analysis portion of this. Being on the sort of priority setting side of CSMI, you can sort of see what's coming and you can sort of, make adjustments to make sure that you're in a position to apply for the money at least. Another area where I think everyone is recognizing this is there's been similar sorts of data that's been collected on multiple lakes, but there's no one in place to do any sort of cross-lake comparison sort of stuff, and there's never going to be anybody to do that at the federal level. So that's what I'm actively doing right now, is writing grants to the Great Lakes Fish Commission to do cross-lake comparisons, essentially, postdoc support to provide cross-lake comparisons for some of these similar data sets that have been collected. In terms of the outreach sort of side of things, I mean, again, I don't think Sea Grant's going to be zeroed out, but they're, at least in my experience, Sea Grant's been a pretty good organization to work with for funding for outreach sort of products.
NSF education programs have been actually quite good, well-funded at Bowling Green, so I think that's another opportunity for outreach activities. So you'd be looking beyond,
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'd say look beyond GLRI and Great Lakes Fisheries, and I think there are plenty of places that, NSF's a little tricky. If you talk Great Lakes, it's got to go to Ocean Sciences, and that's its own battle. I think for outreach, I think NSF would be very good.
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. And there's another program it's a center out of University of Maryland that I've been looking into, and it's something about like Center for Economic. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to remember it, but basically, like the whole point of it is to build these sort of collaborative groups to address a socio-economic sort of problem.
Ecosystem service analysis type stuff.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Paris? Great, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Paris.
Thank you.
So thank you everybody for joining us again. There's surveys you'd like your input, please. Our next candidate will be next week, Tuesday, same time, same place, 4 o'clock.
Thank you.
And so I hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Or any, or Rachel, if you're here, I'd like to hear some information. Yeah. Thank you. Have a good evening. Enjoy the weather.